Hello and welcome to the Alnwick Castle Podcast. I'm Daniel Watkins.
And I'm Deborah Baycroft.
And today we're very happy to be joined by a returning guest. One of our favourite episodes of 2023 was all about the book Mortal Monarchs, when we spoke to its author, the medical historian and TikTok favourite Suzie Edge.
Suzie released her second book in autumn 2023. Vital Organs looks at famous body parts throughout history, from skulls and bones to skin and toes. It's a great read, so we had to get her back on the podcast to tell us more. Suzie will also be appearing in person at Alnwick Castle to talk all things Vital Organs on Saturday the 25th of May. You can get tickets now from alnwickcastle.com or from our page on Eventbrite. We hope you can join us.
And as a bit of a preview for our event with Suzie in May, here's our latest conversation with her. Please enjoy.
So we are thrilled to welcome Suzie Edge to the Alnwick Castle Podcast, a returning guest, to talk all about her new book, Vital Organs. Firstly, how are you, Suzie?
I'm very good, thank you. I'm a little bit cold because we're up in Scotland, but I can't complain too much because I choose to live here, I guess.
So you've created a new book, Vital Organs, a follow-on from Mortal Monarchs, which we talked about a year ago. And this is about famous body parts. And I guess we should start with what the initial inspiration was for this one. What made you hone in on particular bits of the body?
I can't believe it was a year ago. It seems like yesterday. And it's been a bit of a whirlwind. But it did come out of that initial book, actually. When I was researching and writing that book, so many fun little stories were coming up. And I had this weird interest in collecting body part stories. I should say stories there, highlight the stories, but not actual body parts. That would be weird. But collecting the stories over the years, which and it wasn't until I was writing the Mortal Monarchs book that I saw how some of these could come together into a book of their own. I think it started really with Charles I and his neck bone that was stolen out of his coffin a couple of 100 years after his execution, and it was taken and used as a salt shaker. And I just thought this was a brilliant story, and there must be more out there. So I went looking, and head to toe I managed to find so many fun and sometimes gruesome body part stories that could go together.
Gruesome's definitely the word.
Well, people love that, don't they? We love a bit of gore and gruesome.
How much do you love the gore and the gruesome?
Oh, it's everything. It's just everything. I think for the most part, I really love the look of horror and then the enjoyment, turning to enjoyment on people's faces when I start telling the stories. I just love how they get involved and how they can feel it, and you can see them. You can see them not wanting to like the stories, but you can see that they do, and I think that's everything. Yeah.
In the first book, The Mortal Monarchs, it does go through all of the deaths of the monarchs of England, but you made a conscious decision not to put them in this one, isn't that right?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't want to be just doubling up on the things that I'd written, and there were a lot of great monarch body part stories, and a couple of them did sneak through, but there were many from all around the world. So Louis XIV got in there, and then Marie Antoinette, she made it in. So there were royals who weren't in the first book because they weren't English and Scottish, but they did sneak through. Yeah, some of them.
Louis XIV turns up quite a lot. He seemed to have a lot wrong with his body parts.
Oh, I could write a whole book on Louis XIV's body parts alone. I'm even tempted to, actually. The thing about Louis XIV was that those attending to him wrote a lot down, every tiny little detail. And so we know so much about him. But also he was a hypochondriac, and he went through so many ailments. He would have had a huge trolley full of medical notes had he come into hospital now. And he had loads of treatments as well. He was always having enemas. He could be talking to the king, and he'd just be having an enema in the background. In the background is probably the best way to put it, actually. He loved that sort of stuff. And so he had a lot going on, and it was really tempting to write about him all the time. But he sneaked in. But his main story was definitely his bottom problem.
I think that's even on the back cover of the book.
Yeah, well, it's one actually that was early on a story that I told on TikTok and got me the attention on TikTok. I'm going to have to tell it to you now, aren't I?
Yes, please.
So Louis XIV had at some point he sort of felt a pain in his bum, and like all of us, he just didn't leave it alone, prodded and poked it, and it got worse. and worse. And it turned into an abscess, which is just a collection of pus. All the bacteria is breaking down and it collects together. It's nasty and it's grim, but he still didn't leave it alone. And his physicians had a prod and a poke, and they tried to treat it with red hot irons and poultices and all sorts of things, and it didn't work. And actually what happened was the abscess got worse and it turned into a fistula, which is a track, if you like, from one cavity to another. So the body creates these to get the pus out and to try and heal. And effectively he created himself a new hole down there. And it just got worse. It was very painful. And the physicians decided at long last that maybe they needed the help of a surgeon. It happens always in the end, doesn't it? They needed a surgeon, so they got a surgeon in, a chap called Felix, and he had a look between the king's legs, and he couldn't operate straight away because he hadn't done much of that before. So he went out and he practiced on the people of Paris. He found people who had the similar conditions in the hospitals and in the prisons, and he practiced and he developed tools. And then he went back to the king, and he spent a good 3 or 4 hours between the king's legs operating. No anaesthetic, no antiseptic, but it worked, and he healed the king's fistula. And though he needed operations in the future again, for that moment he'd done a good job. And it was remarkable, really, because of how long it took and how he didn't die of an infection. And the king recognised that actually surgery might be a good thing, and he started to recognise the surgeons after that, which was obviously wonderful for my profession.
With Louis XIV, there must be a huge amount of documents with him being king, so you can find this story out. But what about the other people who aren't royals, who don't have lots of documents about their medical procedures? How did you find out information about other people?
It was really tricky, and especially tricky finding information about any women, because it just wasn't documented, it wasn't written down. A lot of the stories are male dominated, and that's just how it is. I can't make things up about women. And the thing was, I wanted to make sure that every story was attached to a person. I couldn't just write stories. I couldn't say, in this particular country in this age they would chop off hands for thieving. That it had to be something specific and to a person. And I found that quite hard. But there are people who have written themselves about their own issues. For instance, Frances Burney, the novelist in the 19th century, she had a mastectomy, and she wrote a letter to her sister 9 months after she had a mastectomy. And this mastectomy, again, like Louis XIV's operation, was pre-anaesthetic, pre-antiseptics. And so she went through this. She had a lump that the surgeons decided they were going to remove. They laid her down, and they put a very thin napkin over her face so that she couldn't see, but she could see through it. And she described seeing the knife coming down towards her chest, and she described feeling the breast tissue being cut away and the knife hitting her breastbone. And it was incredible. So they are out there, some of them. But of course, she was educated. She was a novelist. She was remembered for other things, and therefore we have these letters, and we can remember. But yeah, you're right. It's quite hard to find some of them, especially about women.
One of the other nice things about the book is Mortal Monarchs obviously focused on England and Scotland, but this one goes global a little bit more, and you bring in people from around the world. Sometimes it's as an unfortunate effect of imperialism and colonialism, but it is a much more global book because everyone has body parts, I guess.
Absolutely. And it was definitely the intention from the start that there was no reason to stay. Although a lot of the stories that I know, that I grew up with and that I have collected are British, because we're taught locally first, aren't we, before we're taught around the world with history. Some of them really were a revelation. It was really nice to go and find new stories. I hadn't learned before about the New Zealand, the Maori, the Mokai heads. I'd seen pictures of them in the past, but I didn't really know about them and where they came from and what they were. And so to be able to read about those was a lot of fun to go off around the world.
And going back to the royals, you've obviously got Louis XIV in there a lot, but you've mentioned the Habsburgs quite a bit as well, because they had some issues. Can you explain a little bit about the family, the Habsburgs, and where they come into the book as well?
Yeah, the Habsburgs, well, really we concentrated on Charles II of Spain, because he had the most spectacular Habsburg jaw, which was a phenotype of the Habsburg family because of generation upon generation of inbreeding. They kept it in the family, the Habsburgs. Now, Charles II was born, not many children were born and survived to this family at this point because the inbreeding was so bad. But Charles II got through and he became king. But he had so many genetic problems. He didn't talk before he was 4. He didn't walk before he was 8. They didn't believe it was worth educating him. Why bother, And his jaw was very prominent. His cheekbones were sunken. The portraits that we see of Charles are, you have to remember that these were not warts and all portraits like Cromwell wanted. These were ones that were designed to flatter the sitter. So we look at these portraits and think he must have been worse than that, this huge jaw and nose that we see on him. And he couldn't bring his teeth together. He couldn't bite. It was thought that it was said, that he was so ugly that he terrified his wife. And he did have a wife because he was king. The people were obliged to marry him. He had 2, actually. But he didn't have an heir. And it was not thought to be the fault of his wives that he didn't have an heir. And the thing about Charles was that his being without an heir when he died led to the War of Spanish Succession. And he was the last Habsburg king. He had a wonderful autopsy written, probably embellished, but the doctor that did it described that he found that he had not one drop of blood and that he had a heart the size of a peppercorn and that his lungs were corroded, that his bowels were blackened and gangrenous and his brain was full of water. I think that was embellished, but really it does come down to this inbreeding that the royals did over the years.
It's enough to make you not want to be a royal.
Yeah, I really, from this book and the previous one, I have looked at that and thought, everyone wants to be a princess or a prince or, live in the castle and get the credit. No, absolutely not. It's I've been put off. I'm quite happy in my little anonymous cottage in the Highlands, hiding away from all that. Thank you very much.
One of the things that struck me about all the stories that go through this book is quite a lot of these body parts lead to medical discoveries or innovations. You've mentioned things like anesthetic and antiseptics. And one of the chapters I really liked was about Ignaz Semmelweis and his hands. And he was the subject of a play in London last year with Mark Rylance playing him. It's a great play. But he developed antiseptics and changed the world through the medicine a little bit. And can you talk a little bit about how the medical discoveries are the result of some of these famous body parts?
Absolutely, and they're never plain sailing. So Ignaz Semmelweis was a Hungarian physician who, as you say, he was helping women in an obstetric ward, but also he was studying medicine and the body and cutting up cadavers like many of his colleagues were. And what he realized was that the women who were attended by the doctors who had been cutting up bodies and doing other things, those women tended to have a higher mortality rate. And he wondered why. And he went back and he thought, well, maybe it's got something to do with something being transferred on our hands from the cadavers to the women. He said he called them cadaverous particles initially. And he also understood that, they were wiping down the floors and what have you with antiseptics. And so why not wash hands on the way? And he showed that this worked. This brought down the mortality rate in the birthing women if the doctors were washing their hands. And he went to them and said, look, guys, let's do this. And they said, no, don't be ridiculous. It's got nothing to do with us. We are not spreading disease. And their pride got in the way. He was ridiculed and ostracized. And he ended up in an asylum and beaten to death. And it wasn't that long, really. We're talking a couple of decades before germ theory, Lister, and his germ theory became more recognized and understood. And so Semmelweis really, I think, was just a few decades too early. And he wasn't the only one. There was a doctor in Aberdeen as well doing the same thing. He was funny. He was making meticulous notes about which midwives had gone to see women and which women had then become sick. And when he published this, the nurses got very upset with him because they were like, hang on a minute, you're telling everybody that we're killing people. And it's you, actually. You're the common denominator here, so you have to get out of town. And there was an American as well who around the same time was doing similar things. So there were doctors out there who were noticing that washing hands might be a good thing to do. But there were a lot more doctors out there who would refuse to believe that it was their doing. And so, yeah, he was a bit before his time, Ignaz Semmelweis. What a wonderful play that was with Mark Rylance. I went to see that as well. It was brilliant.
A story I hadn't heard of before I'd seen the play, saw the play, and then he turned up in the contents of Vital Organs and went, I know who this is.
Well, I thought it was a fantastic story. And of course, we still have issues with hand washing, don't we? We still try to convince people this is a good thing, which is bizarre. But I wanted to tell that story, and I thought, what better way to use his hands? Because Ironically, it was his hand when he was beaten that became injured and became infected, and he died of sepsis, the very thing that he was trying to avoid.
What I quite found interesting about that story, and not surprisingly, is that the doctors wouldn't really believe it because it was the women who weren't killing them, the nurses. It was the group of people who were just in that room and who weren't using the cadavers. And obviously, you can understand why they thought it, but it was interesting, I think.
I think we still have a huge amount of problems with people's pride being the biggest enforcer of what they think and how they behave. It's that bit of human nature doesn't change really, does it?
A little bit earlier, you mentioned the reactions you like to get from people of a little bit of disgust, and then it hopefully goes into enjoyment. I wondered if you could make our listeners shudder a little bit by explaining anthropogenic bibliopegy.
Oh my goodness, it's hard to say, isn't it?
It is.
There are throughout the world, throughout libraries, on dusty old library shelves, there are a good number of books that are bound in the leather of human skin. And the most popular, probably not the way to put it, but probably the most famous one would be that of William Burke. William Burke was a murderer in Edinburgh in the 1820s, a friend of William Hare. The two of them, Burke and Hare, went out together and would murder people to sell the bodies to the anatomists to make some money. The anatomists were finding it harder and harder to go out and dig up bodies for their anatomy lessons. And so they would happily pay people who turned up at the door in Edinburgh, the medical school, with their bodies. Burke and Hare realised this. So they started killing people and started selling the bodies. They killed 16 people at least on the streets of Edinburgh until they got caught. And William Hare turned King's evidence, gave all the evidence across and got away and fled. But William Burke was the one who was hanged. And as part of his sentence, it wasn't just that he was going to be hanged, he was going to be dissected as well at the very medical school where he'd been selling the bodies. So his body was taken down and he was dissected by a surgeon, a chap called Munro. At one point he picked up a pen and he dipped it in the blood that was coming out of the cadaver's head, and he wrote on a piece of paper, this is written with the blood of William Burke, murderer, which is wonderful. But also he took the skin and sent it to the tannery, and I'd love to think what the tannery workers must have thought about this human skin that turned up for treatment. But they turned it into leather and they bound a book in it, and that book is in Edinburgh at the I think it's at the Royal College of Surgeons in Edinburgh on display. And that's not the only one. There was another chap in Bristol around about the same time who murdered a woman because she wouldn't go out with him. And he was dissected, and the notes from his dissection and the court notes from his trial were bound in the leather of his skin. And that's on display in Bristol. There's a group in America, the part of the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, whose project is to look at books that claiming to be made of human skin. And they found, I think, they've gone around the world, I think they found 18 or so far that are actually bound up in somebody's skin. So if I tell that story, I often ask which book you'd have bound in your own skin.
Oh, that's a lovely thought. I don't know. Because you want to think, well, what's my favourite book? But you don't want to be bound in...
Yeah, that's it, isn't it? See, my initial thought was, oh, definitely Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. But then I'm like, no, do I want to do that to her? But then it would fit, wouldn't it?
It would, yeah. That's the one that came to my mind.
Oh, interesting.
Just Frankenstein, I think. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, I don't want to think about that one.
Sorry.
That's okay. In terms of the book, you mentioned that these books are on display. Did you go and visit any of the body parts that you talk about in the book that are on display?
I did manage to get to a couple. Some of them were beyond me at the time. I really want to go and see Galileo's middle finger, which is in Florence. I will get to see that at some point. And the Mutter Museum in America as well. I have to get to that. I have spent quite a lot of time at the College of Surgeons in Edinburgh because that's where I sat exams, surgical exams, and I've been to various events there. I just adore it there. The bones, actually, William Burke's bones are in the medical school rather than in that college. One that I did go and try and see was the bones of Charles Byrne, the Irish giant. He was around the same period, actually, although a bit earlier. He was in the late 1700s. A chap from Ireland who had a pituitary tumour that meant that he just kept growing. And he used that to make a bit of money. He would go and show off this giant frame that he had. But the surgeons in America, the hunters, wanted his body when he died. And he said to his friends, I do not want this to happen. Bury me at sea. I don't want my body dissected. And when he died, his friends came into a fair bit of money, and his body ended up with the surgeons being dissected. And his bones are with the Royal College of Surgeons of England. So they are down in London at the Hunterian Museum. For hundreds of years, they were on display there. And I went down to see them with mixed feelings, because there's also a theme through the book of the idea of medical ethics and consent. And this was a strong one for me, that he had this isn't just a body part that was kept without consent. This was a body part that was kept with explicit lack of consent, if that makes sense. So his bones were on display, and I thought, I'm going to write about them. I have to go and see them. And when I got there, it was shut for renovations. And I thought, well, Charles would have liked that, wouldn't he? I couldn't get in. And actually, by the time I went back, by the time they had opened the museum again, when I did go back, they had made the decision that they weren't going to put his bones on display anymore. They are there at the museum, and you can go and see them if you need to for other reasons, but they're not in the big display. And that was really because of our change of attitude towards consent, and recognizing the fact that, a few hundred years later, maybe a bit late, but it was done. He was taken out of that display. So the one that I didn't get to see was probably the most interesting reason for that.
I went to the Hunterian Museum a few years ago, and they were still on display then, and it did feel really uncomfortable.
Oh, that's really interesting.
So it's good that that's been removed. And do you think we're getting better at having respect for other people's bodies?
Oh, blimey. Now there's a question. I think there's a theme again that comes up in both of my books about digging up dead bodies. And the Georgians and the Victorians, my goodness, they didn't care. They were just digging about and taking parts and putting them on display and having them in trophy cabinets and all the rest of it. I do think we're getting better. I think, well, maybe better is the wrong word. We're just changing. We're changing our attitudes and our ideas. And now there is a fight against the idea of selling any body parts, for instance. There was an auction locally up here not so long ago that the Scottish Antiquarian Society were rallying against, because they were selling some old bones and skulls that had been used for anatomy classes many years ago. And I thought that was really interesting, because the antiquarian societies, they grew up on this, going around the world and taking body parts of people. So there's been a huge change, and there's definitely a shift. There's also been a shift in the idea of removing body parts from museums, taking them off the shelves that aren't specifically medical museums. So, we're going back to the Mokai heads again and repatriating them. And I mean, yeah, it's definitely changing.
Which is your favourite story out of the book? Because it does go head to toe. So where's your favourite part of the book, or the body, I suppose?
For sure, my favourite story is the one about a Canadian chap called Alexis St. Martin, who, again, in the 1820s, it's the theme, that, isn't it? I've just realised. It's the theme. He was a fur trader from Michigan, and he had been out trading furs. He was standing in a line at a trading station, and he was accidentally shot in the chest at close range, enough to set his clothes on fire and make a nasty, horrible mess. And a surgeon was called for, and he came and had a look, and he described it. He said that there was bits of ribs sticking out and lung and all sorts, and he tried to put it all back together. And incredibly, despite the medical man's intervention, Alexis St. Martin survived. But he survived with this hole that was left in his chest and abdomen wall. And it healed over, it healed all the skin, but he was left with a hole into his stomach. So the surgeon Beaumont recognised that there was something special here, and he wanted to keep Alexis St. Martin nearby. And Alexis St. Martin was an illiterate man. He couldn't get another job. So Beaumont offered him a job in his household doing chores in exchange for, I'm going to say allowing, but it's not quite right, because again, we're talking about this idea of consent and the power that the doctor had over this man. But he kept him, and he experimented on him. He did hundreds of experiments on this man's stomach. He would stick bits of meat on string and stick them into the hole to see what would happen to the meat, how it would be digested. And he did that with all sorts of things. He would make him drink whiskey and watch it trickle out. And at one point, he even stuck his tongue in the hole to see what it would taste like. And this went on for a long time. he published all his articles and a book, and he became known as the father of gastric medicine. It's a great title. That he became this well-known medical man all about the stomach because of what he did to Alexis St. Martin. Alexis St. Martin one day decided he'd had enough, and he ran away. And he lived. He married. He had children. He lived a long time. He outlived Beaumont by a long time. And when he did die, the army, who was still believed they had some sort of hold over him, wrote a letter to his family saying, "We want the body, or at least here's a bag, send us the stomach so we can keep on studying it." And the family wrote back and said, "Absolutely not, you're not coming anywhere near. In fact, if you do, we're going to shoot you." And they left his body out in the sun for days so that it would rot quickly, so that nobody could do anything more to him, so nobody could take advantage of him. It's a story that went on for decades again, and I really love the reaction I get when I say that the doctor stuck his tongue in the hole. You did it. You both did it. You both looked away and went, "No, you didn't just say that." But yeah, that's.
And the funny thing is, we both read this book, so we knew.
You knew what was coming. Yeah. So that's actually, I mean, it's his stomach, isn't it, that we're talking about? But I became a little bit obsessed with stories about holes that had been made in bodies unintentionally that had stuck around. So there was a chap called Hugh Montgomery in the 1600s who, well, one story says he fell out of a tree, another that he was kicked by a horse. Either way, the ribs over his heart were broken and destroyed, and he was left with a hole into his heart, and you could see it beating. And he was taken to the king, who prodded it and touched this beating heart. You would, wouldn't you? And so those sorts of stories I just love, because often I get asked, well, how didn't they die of an infection? Well, 99 out of 100 other people who had that injury would have done. But what's remarkable is that they didn't, and that's why we remember it, and that's why we can tell the story.
I think we both got the image in our heads reading that part of the book of the king, and his finger just slowly going towards this hole for a little. Yeah.
And Hugh Montgomery actually said that his heart felt nothing. I'm with you there, Hugh.
And I imagine with most people, he would have not allowed them to do that, but you're not going to say no to the king?
No, indeed. Well, he came to the attention of William Harvey, of course, the physician who told us all that the heart was a pump and that the blood was continuously being moved around, and it was Harvey that had a relationship with the king, and so he took him to see him. Yeah.
I've got a hypothetical question.
Oh goodness. Okay.
To go next. So you mentioned Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and I'm going to put you in Victor Frankenstein's lab, and you can use famous body parts from history from your book to create your own super creature. Which bits of which people are you using?
Well, that is amazing. It's really amazing, because most of my body parts have in some way been destroyed or broken, or so it's going to be a mess, my monster. What would I do? Well, I'd start with Einstein's brain. I think we'd put him in there, and Shakespeare's skull as well. That was a story in the book, that Shakespeare's skull was sticking around. I don't want anything that's going to start a war, so Jenkins' ear, we'll leave him out, and Kaiser Wilhelm's arm, we'll leave that out, because we want to be, we don't want to cause trouble. Richard the Lionheart's heart, I think that has to go in there. Ooh, what else? Weirdly, I would actually say Douglas Bader's legs, not his actual legs, but the prosthetic legs, because the story of Douglas Bader and how he survived an air crash, and how he very quickly got back on his new feet, and was flying again during the Second World War is the story I grew up with, my father being in the RAF, and it's a story I love. So we'd stick those in there. Goodness. I love this question. Ooh. You sent me off on one. Have we got enough? We haven't got enough body parts, but we've got a beginning, haven't we?
Yeah, we've got the head, we've got the bottom half, we've got a heart.
Oh well, there you go.
And there are a lot of body parts in the book. Is there any stories that you found that didn't quite fit with the stories that you were telling of each one? Is there anything that you missed putting into the book that you found whilst you were doing your research?
Yeah, and as I said in the beginning, a lot of the stories I wanted to be attached to a specific person. So anything that I found was vaguely about the body I couldn't really put it in unless I had a person attached. I did find one story that I thought was going to be fantastic, and that was that a medical academic had written an idea, a proposal, a hypothesis, I guess, about the opera singer Pavarotti. And they had talked about how it was something to do with Pavarotti's fat cells, his adipocytes themselves. He became fat because he was a singer, and this was all to do with the breathing and the way you have to breathe, stretching, and it was all. And I was like, what is going on here? They're suggesting that, this idea that it's not over till the fat lady sings, and the whole opera singers are big, and they're not. So why is it that they're suggesting that Pavarotti got fat because he was a singer? And I just thought that was fantastic. And I tried to find out more. I tried to look into that. I tried to find something concrete, and sadly I couldn't find anything. All I could find was this hypothesis, and so that was the end of that, because I couldn't write about it. And I thought that's really annoying, because I would have loved that to have come to something. I couldn't make a decent story out of it, so it had to be ditched. So you've got me wondering about that again. I might have to go and find out what on earth that was all about. See, because I ditched it, I can't remember the fine details, but it was all about the stretching of the fat cells when you breathe in and out or something. The idea of wondering whether or not, what came first. Einstein's brain, when it was cut up, they did see some very small differences between his brain and perhaps, everyone else's. And the question for me is, well, did that happen because it was already there, which made him the thinker that he was? Or was he such a great thinker that those connections were made in his brain over his years of living? And so thinking about that in terms of musical or performing or using the body in different ways, that's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
You've sent me off on one now this
Sorry.
afternoon.
What do you want people to take away from the book when they read it?
I think that, as I've sort of said a few times, there are some serious themes throughout the book when we have a think about ethics, morality, and consent. And there are some really silly, fun stories in the book. The thing that I got out of it mostly when researching and writing it was that we often think about history in terms of, dates or wars or lines on maps or what have you. And we forget that these are real, living, breathing people. And I think that's because it's quite hard to imagine, somebody in that way. Whereas when you start talking about something that we have in common, like a nose or an arm or a heart, when you start talking it in those terms, you start to see people as real, breathing human beings, and we have so much in common. And perhaps that might come across as well in the book.
So the book Vital Organs is out now, and on Saturday the 25th of May you will be here with us at Alnwick Castle to talk about it in person. But now that it is out and about in the world, what have you got coming up next?
I've got quite a few projects going on, but in terms of books, I have a children's book that's coming out in April, May, so it will be out by the time I come down in May, actually. There's a series called History Stinks. And so the first one is Poo Through the Ages. So we're going back a long way back to ancient toilets, and we're looking at all the different ways we've dealt with our poo as humans and how it's affected us and how it's changed civilizations and how we've things like the River Thames filling up with poo in Victoria's time and cholera and diseases, and it's more disease and death basically is what I'm trying to say, but it's for kids, so 7+. So that's being illustrated by the amazing Luke Newell, who is very funny, and I can't wait for that to come out, and that's going to be, as I say, that's going to be a series, so there's lots of body parts and bodily fluids and what have you coming out of that. And then in terms of adult books, I've got a big new project which I'm just starting, which is again going to take me off all around the world, and we're going to have a look at the dark death tourism attractions. I'm going to go and visit the places that are associated with death and tragedy that tourists flock to, and have a look at the stories behind them.
That's very interesting.
Mm-hmm. So, that probably brings us to the end. So, thank you very much for joining us once again on the Alnwick Castle podcast, and we will see you in person in May.
I'm really looking forward to it. Can't wait.
Vital Organs is available to buy now from all good bookshops. And of course, you can pick up a signed copy on the 25th of May when you can hear Suzie talk about it in person.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this slightly gruesome episode of the Alnwick Castle Podcast. If you did, we recommend listening back to episode 28, when we spoke to Suzie about her first book, Mortal Monarchs, 1,000 Years of Royal Deaths.
We'll be back in 2 weeks for another episode, and look out for more author interviews further in the future. Until then, I've been Deborah.
And I've been Daniel.
Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.
Bye.